I'll look briefly at an argument we considered earlier in the course. It was this argument. All students watching this lecture are people with interesting life stories. Therefore, some students watching this lecture are people with interesting life stories. We translated this argument into symbolic form using S to represent students watching this lecture and P to represent people with interesting life stories. And then the argument becomes all S or P, therefore some S or P. We created a Venn diagram to test this argument for validity by marking the premise statement only and then looking to see if after doing so, the conclusion statement is also represented by that Venn diagram. So when we marked our premise statement, this was the Venn diagram that resulted. It shows that all the S's are P's. They're all in area 2, but it does not show the conclusion statement, some S or P. Because if it showed the statement some S or P, there'd be an X in area 2, and there's no X there. So that appears to indicate that the argument is invalid. But we said, wait a minute, that seems kind of kooky, right? Because if I assume the premise statement is a true statement, that all students watching this lecture are people with an interesting life story, then that means that every single one of them has an interesting life story. And if every single one of them has an interesting life story, how could it ever be false? How can the conclusion statement ever be false? If every single one of them have this property, wouldn't it be true, have to be true, as the conclusion asserts, that one of them, at least one of them, some, has this property? We said, that doesn't make any sense. But they said, wow, wait a minute. Depends on your assumptions. What are the assumptions that you're operating from with regards to language, logic, and rationality? Are you assuming that the things we're talking about when we make these sweeping claims about all of something, like all students watching this lecture, that we're talking about something that actually exists in reality? Because that's not the assumption that Boole operates from. From the Boolean standpoint, when we make these universal proclamations about our all statements and our no statements, I'm not saying, Boole says, that I'm actually talking about something that exists. And because you don't know the thing I'm talking about actually exists just because I assert something about all of the members of that category, you cannot draw the conclusion from my sweeping universal claim that at least one of these things exists in reality. And that's exactly what's happening in this argument down here. So from the Boolean standpoint, we say, okay, I get that. From the Boolean standpoint, this argument is invalid. But what if we shifted our perspective to the Aristotelian standpoint? What if we said this, look, life is short. You got to figure out how to live the best life you can. And the way that you do that is by having conversations with people about this world that we live in. So when we make arguments about things, we're only going to be talking about things that exist, because to do anything else would be an irrational waste of time. So therefore, if you operate from the Aristotelian standpoint and you make a sweeping claim about all students watching this lecture or no students watching this lecture, I'm assuming that you're talking about something that actually exists. And so therefore, if this is true for all of them, it's got to be true for at least one of them. So you can draw the conclusion some S or P from the conclusion all S or P. And the way we're going to reflect that in our Venn diagram is by marking a circled X in area 2. Because after marking the premise statement, we see that there's only one area of this Venn diagram that remains open for any of the S's to be. And that's area 2. So we mark our X there to indicate that since they're all there, there's at least one there. But we put that circle around the X to say this. There's at least one of these things here, provided these things actually exist in reality. Do S's exist in reality? So this argument from an Aristotelian standpoint is conditionally valid. And the condition that has to be met is that the subject term, S here, students watching this lecture, has to be an actually existing thing, and you exist. So you therefore prove that students watching this lecture is an actually existing thing. So if this is a property that all of these things share, it's a property that at least one of them shares. And we say this has met the condition for validity from the Aristotelian standpoint. Now, a very similar, really the identical principle is going to apply to our Venn diagrams that we create to represent categorical syllogisms and test them for validity. And what we're going to talk about in the next lecture is what the strategy is for marking those Venn diagrams when we're working from the Aristotelian standpoint.